welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. If you've ever played the game of Risk, well, you know that there's some luck in the dice and some strategic maneuvers, but you can end up with a huge invading force against a defenseless adversary. Well, such was the case in Connecticut during the War of 1812. That's when the British outnumbered Patriot forces in the tiny village of Stonington 1,300 to 30. Now, in Risk, the dice control the outcome. In Stonington, it was grit, guts, bravery, determination, and a little luck over 4 days. Here to tell us the incredible story of the Battle of Stonington is the authority on the topic, Tertius Decay. He's author of the book, The Battle of Stonington, Torpedoes, Submarines, and Rockets in the War of 1812. Tertius will be along in a moment to recount this tale. This week's trivia question: it was a lighthouse that guided stagecoaches and not boats, and its source was in a Connecticut town that's been abandoned for more than a century now, with a highly unusual past. Where is that town? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll have the topic for next week's show. The War of 1812 was terrible for the state of Connecticut. Most business owners and merchants here opposed it from the start. Now, we hadn't been too long past the Revolutionary War, where we had fought the British and won our independence, when President James Madison convinced Congress to declare war on Britain again. Now, there were certainly some reasons for it. The British were making it hard for the U.S. to do business in Europe, primarily because England was at war with France, and any American boats doing business with France were being harassed and attacked. Also, the British were forcing Americans to serve in the British Navy. It's a tactic that's called impressing. The British would impress American men into their navy. Well, by the early 1800s, Connecticut frankly relied on sea trade. It was second only to Massachusetts in whaling, and it was a shipbuilding center. So when the British created a naval blockade as part of the War of 1812, it was a huge problem for Connecticut. The British deployed part of their superior naval fleet at the end of Long Island Sound, blocking access to the Atlantic Ocean, and they regularly patrolled in Long Island Sound, harassing ships. Now, Thomas Hardy was the British naval commander responsible for all these Long Island Sound operations for the British, but he was widely viewed as a decent human, somebody who preferred diplomacy to battle. By the time 2 years of the war had transpired, Connecticut had suffered significant financial loss. In April of 1814, the British went up the Connecticut River and destroyed 24 boats in the village of Essex. Then, 4 months later, in August, they would take aim on the tiny village of Stonington. A battle there would be waged over 4 days, and it would feature the British with 4 warships, 1,300 men, and 160 cannons. On shore, the Patriots had just 30 men and 2 cannons. It all began in the most gentlemanly of fashions, with a written warning to evacuate before the shelling began. The man who knows all about this is the man who's written the book on the topic, The Battle of Stonington, Torpedoes, Submarines, and Rockets in the War of 1812, and his name is Tertius Decay. Tertius is 94 years old, he's a former television writer, and he simply found this topic too tempting to pass up. So Tertius, before we get into the actual Battle of Stonington, I've got to ask you, as a writer, why is it that you picked the Battle of Stonington to write this book as what would appear to be on the face of it to anybody who reads it, that you would be a historian, but you're not. So why the Battle of Stonington? Why did you do this book?
I often ask myself that. The fact is that I had moved to Stonington. I had no understanding of the politics or the military operations. I loved the idea of a battle in which this little village fought back against the might of the Royal Navy. And I just wanted to figure out what had happened and how it had happened.
So you just took it upon yourself to do this?
Yeah. It was fascinating, primarily because I found there was so much material that I could look at. I had to know so much about the Royal Navy that I actually became a maritime historian. After the Battle of Stonington, I wrote all sorts of books that were history of navies.
So, Tertius, tell me, I find it interesting that 4 months before the Battle of Stonington, the British go up the Connecticut River to what is today the village of Essex. They destroy the 27 boats that are there, just burn them, which was just a devastating attack. 4 months later, they target the village of Stonington. Now, before we get into the village of Stonington, what happened there was a guy named Stephen Decatur, and he was really the best of the best for the Patriot naval forces, right? And he had been blockaded and pushed into New London, is that right?
Yes, he was in New London, and he was trying to get out, but he was blockaded very efficiently.
Was it British Commander Hardy who had him blockaded in there?
He and Decatur got on very well. Matter of fact, they would never meet each other or anything like that, but Decatur would furnish the British with fresh vegetables so they didn't get scurvy, and Hardy would give good British cheddar cheese to Decatur.
But meanwhile, Hardy wouldn't let him out of New London.
No. What you had was a very eager Stephen Decatur trying to get out and trying to do anything. At one point, he tried to capture Hardy. He found out that Hardy was having lunch most days with a sort of scallywag American civilian, Gardiner's Island. Decatur sent troops over there to capture Hardy. Decatur wanted to be an international scene, and turned out not to be.
Now, you have Hardy and Decatur, you could say somewhat on friendly terms, but not so with Robert Fulton in New York City. He was trying to find ways to use these new bombs, these underwater bombs that some people were calling torpedoes, to actually go out and take out these British ships, right? I mean, tell me a little bit about Fulton.
He was brilliant. He thought the way to win wars, and he was right, was to destroy navies. And the way you destroy navies was with underwater bombs, is what they were. Bombs that you could attach to a ship, have them explode, and sink the ship. It was as simple as that. Very complicated, of course, to actually do it. But he managed to get Congress to pass the Torpedo Act of 1813, which said anybody, whether military or civilian, anybody who can sink a British ship will get full prize money for having done that. That would make anybody who did it a rich man, a very rich man. This got a lot of people interested in doing it. A lot of these sea captains who were very frustrated because they were not able to go out and do their work because the British blockade stopped them. And one of them was a guy named Jeremiah Holmes, who really is one of the important characters, not only in the Battle of Stonington, but pretty much in the whole war effort of the War of 1812. He was working with Decatur, who was working with Robert Fulton.
One of the things that's interesting now, they're coordinating this defense, and this is kind of late in the War of 1812 now, because we're in 1814. Right. And what will happen, I just go into spoiler alert for the people who are listening, right after the Battle of Stonington, a couple weeks later, the British go down, and this is when they did the infamous burning of the White House, and Dolly Madison had to run out with her painting and all those great stories. And it was Hardy's crew that led that. He's in Long Island Sound. He gets orders from his superiors, who I guess are up in Nova Scotia. And what do those orders say to him before he leaves for Washington, D.C.?
He said, you've got to attack some place in your area of coverage. We've got to discourage the Americans from going ahead with their torpedoes and all this actions. The British were very much aware of Robert Fulton and his bombs and his special laws in Congress and all that sort of stuff. They were afraid, because if they were to lose the ship that way, It would be terrible to lose a ship, and it would be a real problem for them. So they said, we've got to discourage the Americans. Okay, attack someplace.
So he gets his orders, and he has to take action at some location, and he picks Stonington. We're not really sure why, but he picks Stonington. And this is now August 9th, and he brings in his 4 big warships right off the coast. And around 5:30 in the afternoon, he sends an ultimatum. What was that all about?
It was a wonderful ultimatum. It was very frightful. He said, I'm going to attack this town, and I'll give you an hour to get out. You've got a lot of innocent civilians here. Get them out of town, and then we'll wipe it out. They could have wiped it out. They had Marine Corps, British Marines, who could have entered the town and, bombed it to pieces. They had all the ships that could be doing that. Particularly important, they had HMS Terror, which is called a bomb ship. It was a special, toughly built ship that would fire howitzers. They were shells filled with gunpowder. They were as good as any bomb up until TNT got invented, and they could have destroyed the town. The funny part was that the people on shore, the Americans, they felt very good about Hardy. They liked him. They said, if we're going to have a war, this is too bad from that point of view, but as long as we're going to be fighting something, we love fighting him because he is known for being a diplomat. His idea was the best warfare is no warfare. Do things by diplomacy. You can get far better results than by doing it with guns. And so they couldn't understand. That was the main thing, is that they got this message, which is now in the Beinecke Library in Yale. It's really kind of wonderful to look at it. Hold it in your hands. This thing said, we're going to attack you. The records show that Amos Palmer, who held a civilian office in Stonington, said to the British, we shall defend this place to the last extremity. Should it be destroyed, we shall perish in its ruin.
Let's just paint this scene. The British have 4 warships, roughly 1,300 sailors, and 160 cannons. When they start the bombardments at 8 p.m. on August 9th, at that point, if I have it right, there's probably about 30 defenders amongst the Patriots. Not quite hadn't gotten to that full complement yet as they're bringing in reinforcements from area towns. And they had 2 cannons. So you talk about the odds. How can you have hope with those kinds of odds?
I think the hope would have come simply because the man was Thomas Hardy. They just couldn't believe that this person with whom they had such a civil relationship, he was known as the peacekeeper. And the fact that he was now being so tough on them, they just couldn't believe it.
In the War of 1812, one of the things that really annoyed the Americans was that the British were impressing American sailors into sort of forced service in the British Navy. And Jeremiah Holmes was one of these, right? He was with the British for 3 years, and then he managed to convince them, look, I'm an American, you got to let me go. He gets away. But during his time with the British, he becomes an expert of firing a cannon in terms of accuracy and whatnot. Now he's firing on them, and if I did my research right, he almost single-handedly caused most of the damage to one of their big ships with his cannon shots. Is that true?
Yes. He was in charge of the 2 cannon, and that's what he was doing. There's another funny thing that Jeremiah Holmes did, the Stonington flag. Stonington had a flag, but it was unlike any that has been seen before or since, because it had 16 stars, which meant that it had to have been sewn together after Tennessee was brought into the nation. And they decided they were going to design an American flag for this new situation. They said, okay, we've got 16 states, so we're going to have 16 stars. Well, it turned out that was in, about 1802 or 1805 or something like that. And it turned out later that Congress never passed a law for a 16-star flag. but it was very hard to take a single star out of a flag. That's why there's one more star in the Stonington flag than there is in the Star-Spangled Banner that was flying in Baltimore.
Did Jeremiah Holmes, was he the one? I heard that one of the cannon fire shots from the British ships ripped the flag off the flagpole where the Stonington cannons were, and they had to be reattached later. Is this the same flag we're talking about?
Yes, and he couldn't reach up to the top of the flagpole, so he got one of the kids to stand on his shoulder and put the flag up there, and that flag is still in existence. It's a wonderful thing. It has lasted this long. And what really put a lump in my throat was to see when they sewed together a replica of it. The flag they had was just falling apart. They now parade around July 4th because the original is just too feeble to make it. And I thought that was wonderful that they realized there are now in the world two 16-star American flags. One's real.
So now we don't need to go through every single day what happened at this hour and what happened at that hour, but suffice it to say there were 4 days of battle starting on the evening of August 9th when he gave him the ultimatum to get out of town. Bombarding continued. There were some negotiations. And what amazes me is after all these days of fighting, the British just leave and they go back to New London, to the Thames River, the mouth of the Thames River, where they had come from. And as the death toll and the damage toll is taken, what started off as an unbelievable advantage for the British, I mean, almost inconceivable, turned into the British had 21 killed, a bunch wounded, and the colonial forces had nobody killed, some wounded. I mean, this is just almost night and day difference in what you would have expected from an outcome.
Yes. I've always been a little mistrustful of the number of British who died because that's not their figure. Their figure is much smaller. I think it's something like 2. But the Americans were under the impression that they had killed many more. And there were a considerable number of wounded. Of course, being wounded in that period of history was very, very serious.
How does Stonington remember this today? Now, thankfully, we have your book that has so much of the detail in it, but every so often, I think even annually, they hold a parade through the borough of Stonington to remember this?
July 4th is a very big day, as is August 10th, which is for the battle. We had a wonderful parade on the bicentennial of the Battle of Stonington back in 2014. People still talk about it. When they made the replica of the 16-star flag, it was for that parade specifically.
You've done all this research into it. How do you, in your mind, sort of summarize and encapsulate the Battle of Stonington, a David-Goliath type of story? How do you view it?
Yes, I think it is a sort of David-Goliath story. When the news of the battle got out, it was a national celebration on it. Tiny but proud Stonington has shown the British what for. It is still a wonderful thing to stand in the borough of Stonington looking at those guns, and those guns are the same ones that we used to defend the village, and recognize that these people had everything to lose, and they fought to the end and won.
When all was said and done, the siege lasted from Tuesday evening, August 9th, through the week to Friday morning, August 12th. Now, it was on Wednesday, August 10th, that the heaviest day of fighting occurred, pretty much nonstop armaments raining down on Stonington. Now, it's estimated that 50 tons of shells hit the village over the 4 days. By the time the dust had settled, one of the 4 British warships had been heavily damaged, Cannon fire had hit it below the water line, meaning it was taking on water and needed to be repaired so it wouldn't sink. In Stonington, 40 structures were either damaged or caught fire, but none was made uninhabitable. And that 16-star flag, the one that had been knocked off the pole by a cannonball and then reattached by a young boy standing on Jeremiah Holmes's shoulders, well, it was still flying at the end of the siege. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Less than a month after this battle in Stonington, well, the War of 1812 ended, and now, of course, the British and U.S. are allies. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Tertius Decay, author of the book The Battle of Stonington, Torpedoes, Submarines, and Rockets in the War of 1812. Well, the answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, it was a lighthouse that guided stagecoaches and not boats, and its source was a Connecticut town, abandoned now for more than a century with a highly unusual past. Where was it? Well, the answer is the Barkhamsted Lighthouse in Barkhamsted, and not a lighthouse at all. Rather, a house that emitted light through cracks in its exterior, but stagecoach drivers came to rely on it. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we'll tell you why. And we'll have the story behind this remote and unusual village. Started as part of a Romeo and Juliet-style backstory and inhabited for 100 years before it was abandoned. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.